The orc houndswoman sat against a fallen beech trunk with her arms folded across her chest, and her jaw set in a way that made it clear she would not be moving. And the gamekeeper stood opposite her with his hands braced on his hips, looking equally immovable, while the last two village men who had stayed 3 nights in the woods with them shifted their weight from foot to foot and stared at the cold remains of the morning fire. 3 days, one of the men said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. We have looked in every hollow and climbed every ridge. The girl is gone. We do not know that, the orc woman said. Her voice was low and rough from calling through the trees, but steady. My hounds have not given up. They circle back to the eastern ridges again and again. Something is there. Or something was there 3 days ago when she first wandered off, the other man said. He was the baker's eldest son, and he had a wife and baby waiting for him back in the village. We have families, Lira. We have work. The mill is standing idle because Henrik is out here instead of grinding grain, and my father is trying to manage the ovens alone. The orc woman, whose name was Lira Zanwick, lifted her eyes to him. In the gray light of dawn, her skin was the color of new leaves, and her small tusks caught the light when she spoke. Then go home. I am not stopping you. The gamekeeper, whose name was Garrett Zane and who had lived in these woods for 20 years, shook his head. If Lira's hounds are still searching, there is still hope, but I will not ask any man to stay who cannot. You have done more than duty required. The 2 village men looked at each other. Relief and shame crossed their faces in equal measure. You are sure? The baker's son asked. Go, Garrett said. Tell the village we are continuing the search. Tell them we will send word when we have news. The men left within the hour, heading west toward the village with their packs light and their steps quick. Garrett watched them disappear into the morning mist, then turned to find Lira already checking her hounds. She had 5 of them, all leggy and rough-coated, bred for stamina and nose rather than speed. They milled around her, whining softly, and she moved among them with practiced hands, checking paws and joints and the set of their ears. Your pack is tired, Garrett said. They will rest when we find her. Lira straightened and met his eyes. You did not have to stay either. Yes, I did. Something in his voice made her pause. She studied him for a moment. This man who was respected throughout the village and the surrounding farms, who could read weather in the sky and tracks in the mud, and who never took payment for helping find lost livestock or guiding hunters to good ground. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that came from a lifetime of walking hills. His hair was dark brown and touched with gray at the temples, and his face was weathered in a way that made his age hard to guess. He might have been 35. He might have been 45. His eyes were gray-green, the color of riverstones, and they held something old and unhealed. There is a story there, Lira said quietly. There is. Garrett picked up his pack and shouldered it. But it can wait. Show me where your hounds want to go. They moved east through the beech woods, following the line of the ridge where the land folded into steep little valleys thick with bracken and blackberry. The hounds ranged ahead, noses down, working the scent in silence. Lira had trained them not to bay, and they communicated with her through the angle of their tails and the pace of their movement. Garrett had hunted with dogs his whole life, but he had never seen a pack work with such discipline. How long have you been breeding them? He asked when they stopped at midday to rest and water the animals at a spring. Since I was 14. Lira knelt beside the spring and filled her water skin. My mother kept hounds and her mother before her. In my clan, the women are the trackers. The men do the heavy work, the building and the hauling, but when something is lost, they come to us. Where is your clan now? 3 days north, in the hill country beyond the old border. Lira drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. I come down to the lowland villages in summer to work. The pay is better and I like the woods here. The beaches remind me of home." Garrett nodded. He had hired her a week ago when the miller's daughter had failed to come home from picking berries, and he had been impressed from the start by her competence and her calm. She did not waste words or movement, and she did not flinch from long hours or rough ground. She was younger than he had expected when he first saw her, perhaps 25, and she moved through the woods with the easy confidence of someone who had spent her whole life in wild places. "The village will pay you regardless of whether we find the girl," he said. Lira looked at him sharply. "I do not want payment for failure. It would not be failure. You have done everything that could be done." "Not yet." She stood and whistled softly to the hounds. They came to her immediately and she checked them over again before they set out. "We have daylight left. Let us use it." They searched through the afternoon, working deeper into the eastern ridges where the land grew wilder, and the beech trees gave way to oak and hazel. The hounds moved with purpose, following a scent that Garrett could not detect, but that clearly held meaning for them. Twice they circled back to the same ravine, a steep-sided cut in the hillside where a stream ran fast and cold over mossy stones. Lira stood at the top of the ravine and frowned down into the shadows. "She was here," she said. "Or something of hers was, but the trail keeps breaking." "Breaking how?" "As if she was carried, or as if the scent was moved deliberately." Lira started down the side of the ravine, using tree roots and rocks for handholds. Garrett followed, and the hounds scrambled after them, their claws scrabbling on the wet stone. At the bottom, the air was cold and smelled of leaf mold and water. Lira quartered the ground slowly, letting the hounds work, and Garrett searched the underbrush for any sign of passage. He found it near a stand of young hazels, a scrap of blue fabric caught on a thorn. He called Lira over, and she took the fabric carefully, holding it to the light. "This is from a child's dress," she said. "The weave is fine, miller's work. The girl's father is the miller." Garrett felt something loosen in his chest, the first real hope he had allowed himself in 3 days. "She was here. 2 days ago, I think, maybe 3. Lira gave the fabric to the hounds to scent, and they cast around eagerly, tails high. "The trail goes upstream into the high ground." They followed the ravine until the light began to fail, and then Garrett called a halt. "We need to make camp. We cannot search in the dark, and we will be no use to the girl if we exhaust ourselves." Lira wanted to argue. He could see it in the set of her shoulders and the way her hands tightened on the lead she held. But she was practical, and she knew he was right. "There is a charcoal burner's hollow 1/2 mile west," she said. "I saw the remains of a kiln when I scouted this area yesterday. We can shelter there." The hollow was exactly where she said it would be. A circular clearing hacked out of the hillside with a stone kiln built into the slope, and a lean-to shelter that had mostly collapsed, but still had enough roof to break the wind. Garrett cleared the ground while Lira tended the hounds, feeding them dried meat and checking their paws for thorns. Then he built a fire in the remains of the kiln, coaxing flames from the charcoal dust that still lay thick on the ground. The fire caught quickly and burned hot, and soon the hollow was filled with warmth and light. They ate in silence, sharing hard bread and cheese and the last of the dried apples Garrett had brought from his lodge. The hounds curled up in a heap near the fire, exhausted, and Lira sat with her back against a log and her legs stretched out in front of her. She had taken off her boots, and Garrett could see that her feet were blistered and raw. "You should have said something," he said. "It does not matter." Lira wiggled her toes toward the fire. "They will heal. It matters if you cannot walk tomorrow." Garrett dug in his pack and pulled out a tin of salve. "This will help." Lira eyed the tin suspiciously. "What is in it? beeswax, tallow, and comfrey, my mother's recipe." He held it out, and after a moment she took it. "It works, I promise." She opened the tin and sniffed it, then began working the salve into her blisters with careful fingers. Garrett watched the fire and tried not to think about the miles they still had to cover or the cold that would set in once the sun was fully down. The night was clear, and the stars were beginning to show through the branches overhead. It would be a cold night, but not a dangerous one. "Why did you stay?" Lira asked suddenly. "The other men had families and work waiting for them. You could have sent me on alone and gone back to guide others if I found something." Garrett was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance an owl called. 11 years ago," he said finally, "I was part of a search party looking for a shepherd who had gone missing in a storm. We searched for 2 days, and on the second night the man leading the search said we should turn back. The storm was getting worse, and we were all half frozen and exhausted. I agreed with him. I said we had done everything we could and that it was time to go home." He paused and stared into the flames. "We found the shepherd the next morning, less than a mile from where we had turned back. He had taken shelter under a ledge, but he had frozen to death in the night. If we had kept searching, we would have found him alive." Lira stopped rubbing the salve into her feet and looked at him. "That was not your fault. I agreed to stop. I could have argued for continuing, but I did not. I was cold and tired, and I wanted to go home." Garrett's voice was flat and distant. "The shepherd had a wife and 3 children. They lost everything when he died. The farm went to his brother, and the wife and children had to move to her family's home in another village. I see them sometimes at market. The eldest son is 16 now, nearly a man. He looks just like his father." "You have carried this for 11 years, Lira said softly. "Yes. And you will carry it until you find someone alive." "Yes." Lira finished with the salve and handed the tin back to him. "Then we will find this girl. And maybe you can begin to forgive yourself." "Maybe." Garrett put the tin away and added more fuel to the fire. The flames leaped higher, throwing wild shadows on the stones of the old kiln. "Tell me about your hounds. How do you train them to work so quietly?" Lira understood that he was changing the subject, and she let him. She began to talk about her breeding program, about the careful selection of temperament and nose and stamina, and about the long process of training that began when the pups were still nursing. Garrett listened and asked questions, and slowly the tension in his shoulders eased. They talked for an hour, maybe more, and then Lyra's voice began to slow and her answers grew shorter. Garrett glanced at her and saw that her eyes were drooping. "You should sleep," he said. "I will keep the fire going and wake you in a few hours. We should both sleep." Lira tried to stifle a yawn. "You need rest as much as I do." "I am used to long nights. I will be fine." Lira started to argue, but another yawn caught her and she gave up. She shifted her position, trying to get comfortable against the log, but the ground was hard and uneven, and after a few minutes she made a frustrated noise and sat up again. "Here." Garrett moved to sit beside her, his back against the log. "Use my shoulder. It is better than the ground." Lira hesitated, but exhaustion was winning over propriety. She shifted closer and leaned against him, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. She was warm and solid, and she smelled of wood smoke and dog and the green scent of crushed bracken. Garrett felt her relax by degrees, her breathing slowing, and within minutes she was asleep. He sat very still, not wanting to wake her. The fire burned steadily, and the hounds snored in their pile, and overhead the stars wheeled slowly across the sky. Garrett's shoulder began to ache after the first hour, and by the second hour it had gone numb, but he did not move. Lira needed the rest, and he would not take it from her. He watched the fire and thought about the shepherd who had died in the cold, and about the miller's daughter who was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. He thought about the weight of responsibility and the cost of failure, and he wondered if Lira was right, if finding this girl alive would finally let him forgive himself for a decision made 11 years ago on a night much like this one. The night grew colder, and Garrett added fuel to the fire with his free hand, moving slowly and carefully so as not to disturb Lira. She stirred once, murmuring something in her sleep, and her hand came up to rest on his chest. Garrett froze, but she did not wake, and after a moment he let himself breathe again. Her hand was warm through his shirt, and he could feel the steady beat of his own heart under her palm. He had been alone for a long time. He had devoted himself to his work as gamekeeper, to the endless task of walking the woods and tending the land and helping the people who lived on its edges. He had friends in the village, men he drank with and women who brought him food when they thought he was looking thin. But he had never let anyone close enough to touch the place where his guilt lived. He had thought he did not deserve that kind of closeness, that kind of comfort. But now, with Lira sleeping against his shoulder and her hand over his heart, he felt something shift. Not the guilt going away, but the first small possibility that he might someday be able to live with it. The stars faded as dawn approached, and the sky lightened from black to gray to pale gold. The hounds woke and stretched, and the fire burned down to coals. Lira stirred and lifted her head, blinking in the early light. For a moment she seemed confused, and then she realized where she was and pulled back quickly. "I fell asleep on you," she said, and there was horror in her voice. "Garrett, I am so sorry. You should have woken me. You needed the rest." Garrett flexed his shoulder carefully, trying to get feeling back into it. "It is fine." "It is not fine. You sat awake all night because I could not stay on my own side of the fire." Lira stood and began pacing, her movements jerky with embarrassment. "That was inappropriate and unprofessional, and I should have, Lira." Garrett stood as well, rolling his shoulder. "It was one night. Do not make it into something it was not." But Lira was not listening. She was already pulling on her boots and calling the hounds to her, her face set in hard lines. Garrett recognized the look. She was angry at herself, and she would take that anger out on the work ahead. He let her be and focused on kicking dirt over the coals and gathering his gear. Within minutes, they were ready to move, and Lira set off at a punishing pace that had them both breathing hard within the first mile. They found the trail again at mid-morning, where the ravine opened into a bowl-shaped valley thick with ferns and young ash trees. The hounds grew excited, their tails whipping back and forth, and Lira had to hold them back to keep them from bolting ahead. Garrett could see fresh disturbance in the undergrowth now, places where ferns had been crushed and branches broken, and his heart began to pound. "She is close," Lira said, her voice tight. "The hounds are sure." They moved faster, pushing through the ferns and scrambling over fallen logs. The hounds led them to the far side of the valley, where the hillside rose steep and rocky. And there, tucked under an overhang and half hidden by a tangle of blackberry canes, was what remained of a poacher's hide. It had been built into the hillside, a rough shelter of stacked stones and woven branches, and part of the roof had collapsed inward. Garrett saw a small, pale hand sticking out from under the debris, and he was moving before he could think, tearing away the branches and stones with his bare hands. The miller's daughter lay curled on her side, her dress torn and filthy, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and she was shivering with cold and shock. But her eyes were open, and when she saw Garrett she made a small broken sound that was half sob and half laugh. "I knew someone would come," she whispered. "I knew you would not stop looking." Garrett felt his throat close. He pulled off his cloak and wrapped it around her carefully, talking to her in a low, steady voice, while Lira knelt beside them and began examining the broken leg. The girl's name was Emma, and she was 6 years old, and she had been picking berries when she had wandered too far from the path and gotten lost. She had stumbled into the poacher's hide in the dark, looking for shelter, and the roof had collapsed on her when she tried to move. "How long have you been here?" Lira asked gently. "I do not know. 2 days, I think, maybe 3. I tried to call for help, but no one came." Emma started to cry, and Garrett gathered her up carefully, mindful of her leg. She was tiny and light, all bird bones and sharp angles, and she clung to him with desperate strength. "We are here now," he said. "You are safe. We are going to take you home." Lira splinted the leg with branches and strips torn from her own shirt, working quickly and competently. Emma whimpered but did not cry out, and when Lira was done, she looked up at Garrett with worried eyes. "She needs a surgeon. That break is bad, and she has been lying in the cold for days. If infection sets in, then we get her to the village as fast as we can." Garrett adjusted his grip on Emma and stood. "Can you manage the hounds and the gear?" "Yes. Go. I will follow." Garrett set off at a steady jog, holding Emma against his chest and picking his way carefully over the rough ground. Lira followed with the hounds, and they made good time through the valley and back up the ravine. By midday, they were on the main path that led west toward the village, and Garrett's legs were burning and his lungs were screaming, but he did not slow down. Emma had stopped crying and was lying very still in his arms, and that worried him more than anything else. They met the first of the searchers 2 miles from the village, a group of farmers who had come out at first light to make one more sweep of the near woods. When they saw Garrett with the girl in his arms, they shouted and ran toward him, and within minutes there was a crowd of people surrounding them, all talking at once and reaching out to touch Emma as if to reassure themselves that she was real. "Get the surgeon," Garrett said to the nearest man. "And someone ride ahead and tell her parents we have found her." The crowd parted to let him through, and he walked the last 2 miles with an escort of farmers and village folk, all of them exclaiming over Emma and asking questions that Garrett did not have the breath to answer. Lira walked behind him, ignored, her hounds trailing at her heels. Garrett glanced back once and saw the set of her face, the way she held herself apart from the celebration, and he felt a flicker of unease. They reached the village in the early afternoon, and the miller and his wife came running out of their house, the wife sobbing and the miller white-faced with shock and relief. Garrett handed Emma over to her mother, and the surgeon, a sharp-eyed older woman named Mistress Hale, took charge immediately, barking orders and shooing everyone back so she could examine the girl properly. Garrett stood in the street, suddenly hollow and exhausted, and watched the miller's wife carry Emma into the house. The crowd was still talking, still exclaiming, and someone clapped him on the shoulder and said something about a miracle. Garrett nodded and tried to smile, but his legs were shaking and his vision was graying at the edges. He needed to sit down. He needed water. He needed— "Where is Lira?" he asked suddenly, looking around. The orc woman, the man who had clapped his shoulder, frowned. "I do not know. She was here a moment ago." Garrett pushed through the crowd, looking for her green skin and dark hair, but she was nowhere to be seen. He found her hounds tied to a post near the village well, but Lira herself had vanished. Garrett felt the unease sharpen into something closer to alarm. He went to the well and drew a bucket of water, drinking deeply and splashing his face, and then he started asking questions. No one had seen where Lira had gone. No one had thanked her or acknowledged her part in the rescue. They had all been too focused on Emma and on congratulating Garrett for bringing her home. Garrett cursed under his breath and went to find the village headman, a stolid farmer named Roland who had lived in the village all his life. "I need to make sure Lira Zanwick is paid," Garrett said without preamble. "And I need someone to see to her hounds. She has been working for 4 days straight with almost no rest." Roland nodded slowly. "Of course. The village will honor its debt. Where is she now?" "I do not know. She was here and then she was gone." Roland frowned. "That is strange, but I am sure she will turn up. Perhaps she went to find a place to rest." Garrett was not so sure, but he was too tired to argue. He went to collect Lira's hounds and led them to his lodge on the edge of the village, where he fed them and gave them water and let them sleep in his workroom. Then he collapsed into his own bed and slept for 14 hours straight. He woke in the dark with a sense of urgency that he could not immediately place. He lay still, listening to the night sounds, and then he remembered. Lira. He had not seen her since the moment they reached the village, and he had no idea where she had gone or if she was all right. He got up and dressed quickly, lighting a candle and moving quietly so as not to wake the hounds. Then he went out into the night, heading for the village. The streets were dark and empty, but there was a light burning in the miller's house, and Garrett went there first. The miller's wife answered the door, and her face was drawn with exhaustion but glowing with joy. "She is going to be all right," she said before Garrett could ask. "Mistress Hale set the leg and said it should heal clean if we keep it splinted and watch for infection. Emma is asleep now, but she has been asking for you. She wants to thank you for finding her." "It was not just me," Garrett said. "Lira Zanwick and her hounds did most of the work. I only carried Emma home." The miller's wife nodded, but there was something guarded in her expression now. "Yes. The orc woman. We owe her a debt as well. Where is she? I do not know. I have not seen her since you brought Emma back." The miller's wife hesitated, then added, "There has been talk, Garrett. Some of the men are saying that it was strange how quickly she found Emma, and how the girl was in a poacher's hide that no one knew about. They are saying it is suspicious." Garrett felt cold anger bloom in his chest. "Suspicious how?" "They are saying that perhaps the orc woman knew where Emma was all along, that perhaps she was the one who took her, or that she was working with someone who did." "That is insane." Garrett kept his voice low with effort. "Lira has been searching for 4 days straight. She nearly crippled herself walking on blistered feet because she refused to give up. She is the reason Emma is alive. I know, and I believe you, but you know how people are. They see an orc and they think the worst." The miller's wife glanced back into the house, where her daughter lay sleeping, and her expression softened. "I will speak in Lira's favor if anyone asks me, and I will make sure the miller does the same. But you should be careful, Garrett. There is a mood in the village tonight, and it is not a kind one." Garrett left the miller's house and walked through the village, stopping at the tavern and the smith's forge and the houses of the men he knew best. Everywhere he went, he heard the same whispers. The orc woman had found Emma too easily. The girl had been in a place no one else knew about. It was all very convenient. Garrett argued and defended and grew angrier with every conversation, but he could see that the suspicion had already taken root. People wanted someone to blame for Emma's ordeal, and Lira was an easy target. He found her just before dawn, sleeping rough in a hay barn on the edge of the village with her pack as a pillow, and her cloak pulled tight around her. She woke when he entered, her hand going to the knife at her belt, and then she saw who it was and relaxed slightly. "You should not be here," she said. "People will talk. People are already talking." Garrett sat down on a bale of hay and told her what he had heard. Lira listened in silence, her face unreadable, and when he was done, she shook her head slowly. "I should have expected this," she said. "It is always the same. When things go wrong, blame the orc. It is not right. No, but it is the way of things. Lira stood and began rolling up her cloak. I will leave this morning. I do not want to cause trouble for you or for the village. You are not causing trouble. Ignorant people are causing trouble. Garrett stood as well. Stay. Let me talk to the headman and the reeve. We can sort this out. And say what? That I am innocent. They will not believe you. They will say you are defending me because you are a good man and I have deceived you. Lira slung her pack over her shoulder. It is better if I go. Lira, thank you for finding me and for taking care of my hounds. I will collect them and be gone by mid-morning. She started for the door and Garrett moved to block her path. Wait, please. Lira stopped, but she did not meet his eyes. What do you want me to say, Garrett? That I am angry, I am. That I am hurt, I am, but I am also practical. I have been an orc woman in human lands long enough to know when I am not welcome. I will leave, and in a few weeks people will forget I was ever here, and life will go on. I will not forget. The words came out more intense than Garrett had intended, and Lira finally looked up at him. You saved that girl's life. You did not give up when everyone else did, and you walked yourself bloody to keep searching. That means something. It means everything. To you, perhaps, but not to them. Lira's voice was soft and sad. I appreciate your faith in me, Garrett. But I have learned not to expect justice in places where I am not wanted. She stepped around him and walked out of the barn, and Garrett stood alone in the dusty light and felt the anger in his chest turn to something colder and harder. He thought about the shepherd who had died in the cold, and about the 11 years he had spent trying to atone for a single decision. He thought about Lira sitting awake by the fire with blistered feet, refusing to give up, and about the way she had fallen asleep on his shoulder because she trusted him enough to let her guard down. And he thought about the village he had served faithfully for 2 decades, the people he had helped and guided and protected, and how quickly they had turned on someone who had done nothing but help them. He left the barn and went to find Roland, the headman. He found him at the mill, talking with the miller about getting the wheel turning again, and Garrett interrupted without apology. We need to talk about Lira Zanwick. Roland sighed. Garrett, I know you are loyal to her, but you have to understand. No, you have to understand. Garrett's voice was hard. That woman worked for 4 days to find Emma. She refused to give up when everyone else did, including me at one point. She is the reason that girl is alive. And now half the village is whispering that she is a criminal or a conspirator, and it is based on nothing but prejudice and fear. People are just asking questions, the miller said, but he looked uncomfortable. It is natural to wonder about what? About how she did her job well. About how she has skills that most people do not. Garrett turned to Roland. You hired her. You told me she came recommended by 3 other villages and that her record was spotless. Has any of that changed? No, Roland admitted. But people are scared, Garrett. A child went missing and people want answers. Then get answers. Do not just accept rumors. Garrett crossed his arms. Emma is awake, is she not? Ask her what happened. Let her tell her story and search that poacher's hide. If there is evidence of who built it or who has been using it, find it. Roland and the miller exchanged glances. That is fair, Roland said slowly. We should have done that from the start. I will talk to Mistress Hale and see if Emma is strong enough to answer questions, and I will send some men back to the hide to search it properly. Do it today. Garrett did not wait for an answer. He turned and left, heading back toward his lodge. He found Lira there collecting her hounds, and he told her what he had arranged. It will not matter, Lira said, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. People believe what they want to believe. Maybe. But we are going to give them the truth and make them look at it. It took 3 days. 3 days in which Lira stayed at Garrett's lodge, out of sight and out of mind, while he went back and forth to the village, pushing Roland and the reeve to investigate properly. Emma, when she was strong enough to talk, told a story that was simple and heartbreaking. She had wandered off the path while picking berries, had gotten turned around in the woods, and had stumbled into the hide in the dark while looking for shelter. She had been alone the entire time, and she had not seen anyone until Garrett and Lira found her. The men who searched the hide found more snares and traps, all of them marked with a distinctive notch that was known to belong to a local poacher named Tom Rickshaw. They also found a stash of pelts and a small cache of coins, evidence that Rickshaw had been using the hide for months. When confronted, Rickshaw panicked and tried to shift the blame, claiming that he had seen the orc woman near the hide days before Emma went missing, and that she must have been involved. But the evidence did not support his story, and Emma's account contradicted it directly. The Reeve, a shrewd older man who served 3 villages and took his duties seriously, ruled that Rickshaw was at fault for building an unsafe structure on common land and for poaching, and that Lira Zanwick was innocent of any wrongdoing. Rickshaw was fined and sentenced to a month of labor on the village roads, and the Reeve made a point of thanking Lira publicly for her work in finding Emma. It should have been the end of it. But even after the Reeve's ruling, there were people in the village who muttered and looked at Lira with suspicion. She heard the whispers and saw the looks, and Garrett saw the way she held herself tighter, the way she kept her eyes down and her movements careful. She stayed at his lodge for a week, and then she said it was time to go. "The work is done," she said, "and I am not welcome here. It is better if I leave." "You are welcome in my home," Garrett said. Lira looked at him, and there was something raw and unguarded in her eyes. "I know. And I am grateful, but I cannot stay where I am seen as a threat. It is too hard, Garrett. I am too tired." Garrett wanted to argue, but he understood. He had seen the toll the week had taken on her, the way her shoulders had bowed and her smiles had faded. "Where will you go?" "North, back to my clan. It is time I went home for a while." Lira began packing her gear, moving with the efficiency of long practice. "I will leave tomorrow at first light. Will you come back? I do not know. Maybe, if there is a reason to." She glanced at him, and something passed between them. Some unspoken question that neither of them was ready to ask aloud. Garrett lay awake that night, thinking about the question he had not asked, and the answer he had not given. He thought about Lira falling asleep on his shoulder by the fire, and about the way her hand had rested over his heart, and about the quiet competence and strength that he had come to admire so deeply over the past week. He thought about the years he had spent alone, walking the woods and serving the village and holding himself apart from anything that felt like hope or joy. And he thought about the shepherd who had died in the cold, and about Emma who was alive, and about the fact that he had finally done the thing he had failed to do 11 years ago. He had kept searching until he found someone alive. It did not erase the guilt, but it made it bearable. And Lira had been part of that. She had refused to give up, and her refusal had given him the strength to keep going. He owed her for that. He owed her more than he could say. He got up before dawn and found Lira already awake, feeding her hounds and checking their paws. He watched her for a moment, memorizing the line of her shoulders and the way her hands moved, quick and sure. Then he went to help her, and they worked in silence until the hounds were ready and Lira's pack was shouldered. "Thank you," she said as she stood in the doorway, ready to leave. "For believing in me, for fighting for me. It meant more than you know." "Come back," Garrett said. "When you are ready, come back." Lira nodded, and then she was gone, her hounds trailing after her, and Garrett stood alone in his lodge and felt the weight of everything he had not said pressing against his chest. The summer moved forward. Emma's leg healed clean, and she walked with only a slight limp that Mistress Hale said would fade with time. Tom Rickshaw finished his sentence and left the village, heading east toward the coast where he had family. The beech woods grew thick and green, and Garrett walked them as he always had, checking the game trails and marking the territories of fox and deer and boar. The village folk thanked him when they saw him, and some of them asked after the orc woman who had found Emma, and Garrett told them that she had gone north to visit her clan, and that he did not know when she would return. He did not tell them that he thought about her every day, that he looked for her in the woods, half expecting to see her moving through the trees with her hounds at her heels, that he woke in the night sometimes and remembered the weight of her head on his shoulder and the warmth of her hand over his heart, and that those memories were more precious to him than anything else he owned. The months passed. Summer turned to autumn, and the beeches shed their leaves in drifts of gold and bronze. Garrett began preparing for winter, stocking his lodge with firewood and meat and making sure the village was ready for the cold months ahead. He did not expect to see Lira again. She had been clear that she did not know if she would return, and he understood that. The village had treated her badly, and she had every reason to stay away. But then, in late autumn, a messenger came from the reeve with word that Tom Rickshaw had been caught poaching on a neighboring lord's land, and that he would be tried at the assize court in the spring. The reeve wanted statements from everyone involved in the Emma incident, including Lira Zanwick, and the messenger asked if Garrett knew where she could be found. Garrett wrote a letter that night, addressed to Lira in care of her clan in the hill country, explaining what had happened and asking if she would be willing to come south to give her testimony. He sent the letter with a trader who was heading north, and then he waited. The reply came 6 weeks later, delivered by the same trader on his way back south. Lira's handwriting was clear and angular, and her message was brief. She would come, she would testify, and she would arrive in the village a week before the assize. Garrett read the letter 3 times, looking for something more, some hint of what she was thinking or feeling, but there was nothing. Just the facts, plain and simple, the way Lira always was. He told Roland and the reeve that Lira had agreed to come, and he made arrangements for her to stay at his lodge again. Roland looked uncomfortable but did not argue, and the reeve nodded approvingly. "She did good work," the reeve said, "and she deserves to be heard. Make sure the village knows she is coming, and that she is here as a witness, not a defendant." Garrett did his best, but he could see that the news of Lira's return stirred up old tensions. Some people were glad that she would testify against Rickshaw, but others muttered that it was a waste of time to bring an orc all the way from the hill country just to tell a story everyone already knew. Garrett ignored them and focused on preparing his lodge, cleaning the spare room and making sure there was enough food and firewood to last through her visit. Lira arrived on a cold afternoon in early spring, riding a sturdy hill pony and leading her hounds on a long line. Garrett saw her coming from a distance and went out to meet her on the road. She looked thinner than he remembered, and there were shadows under her eyes, but she smiled when she saw him and dismounted to clasp his hand. "It is good to see you," she said, and there was warmth in her voice that made his heart lift. "It is good to see you too." Garrett took the pony's reins and led it toward the lodge. "How was the journey?" "Long, but not difficult. The weather has been mild." Lira walked beside him, her hounds sniffing at his legs and wagging their tails. "How is Emma?" "Well, her leg healed clean and she is running around like nothing ever happened. She asks about you sometimes." "Does she?" Lira sounded surprised. "I did not think she would remember me." "She remembers. She talks about the lady with the dogs who found her in the woods." Garrett opened the door to the lodge and ushered Lira inside. "She will want to see you while you are here." They settled into an easy routine over the next few days. Lira helped Garrett with his work, walking the woods with him and lending her sharp eyes to the task of tracking game and checking traps. They talked as they walked, sharing stories and observations, and Garrett found himself relaxing in a way he had not in months. It was as if some part of him that had been clenched tight since she left was finally loosening, and he could breathe properly again. Emma came to visit on the third day, brought by her mother, who thanked Lira formally and with genuine warmth. Emma, shy at first, quickly warmed up when Lira let her pet the hounds and showed her how to read their moods by the set of their ears and the wag of their tails. The girl was bright and curious, and she peppered Lira with questions about tracking and dogs and life in the hill country. Lira answered patiently, and Garrett watched the two of them together and felt something settle in his chest, some wordless certainty that this was right. The assize was held on a cold, bright morning in the village square, with the reeve presiding and a crowd of villagers gathered to watch. Tom Rickshaw was brought in from the neighboring Lord's jail, looking sullen and defiant, and the reeve called witnesses one by one. Emma testified first, her voice small but clear, and she told her story exactly as she had before. Then the miller and several other villagers testified about the poacher's hide and the evidence they had found there. Lira was called last. She stood before the reeve and the crowd, her back straight and her voice steady, and she recounted the search in careful detail. She talked about the way the hounds had worked, the signs they had followed, the moment they had found Emma in the collapsed hide. She did not embellish or dramatize. She simply told the truth, and her calm competence was more convincing than any flourish could have been. When she was done, the reeve nodded. "Thank you, Mistress Zanwick. Your testimony is clear and credible." He turned to Rickshaw. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Rickshaw glared at Lira, and for a moment Garrett thought he would try to accuse her again. But the poacher must have seen the mood of the crowd, because he just shook his head and looked at the ground. The reeve pronounced his judgment. Rickshaw was guilty of poaching and of endangering a child through his reckless building on common land. He was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor and a fine that would go to the miller's family as compensation. The crowd murmured approval and Rickshaw was led away, still glaring. Lira stepped down from the witness stand and Garrett moved to meet her. "You did well," he said quietly. "It is over." Lira looked tired but relieved. "I can go home now. Stay for a few more days. There is something I want to show you." Lira looked at him curiously but nodded. "All right." They left the village the next morning, heading east into the beech woods. Garrett led the way, taking a path that wound up into the hills, and then down into a secluded valley, where a stream ran clear and fast over rounded stones. The valley was sheltered from the wind, and even in early spring it was lush and green, with primroses blooming on the banks of the stream and blackbirds singing in the hazels. "This is beautiful," Lira said, looking around. "I have never been in this part of the woods. It is my favorite place." Garrett knelt by the stream and filled his waterskin. "I come here when I need to think." Lira knelt beside him, and they sat in silence for a while, listening to the water and the birds. Then Garrett said, "I want to ask you something, but I do not want you to feel obligated to answer." Lira turned to him, her expression serious. "Ask. Why did you come back? You could have sent a written statement to the reeve. You did not have to make the journey." Lira was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I came back because I wanted to see you." Garrett's heart gave a hard thump. "Lira, I have been thinking about that night by the fire," Lira said, her voice low. "The night I fell asleep on your shoulder. I have been thinking about the way you sat awake all night rather than move me, and about the way you fought for me when the village turned against me. I have been thinking about you, Garrett, and I cannot stop." Garrett reached out and took her hand. Her skin was warm and rough from work, and her fingers curled around his with surprising strength. I have been thinking about you too, every day since you left. I do not know if this can work, Lira said. You are human and I am an orc. People will talk. They will make things difficult. Let them talk. Garrett lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. I have spent 11 years trying to atone for a mistake, and you helped me do that. You showed me that it is possible to keep searching, to keep trying, even when everything seems hopeless. You gave me that gift, Lira, and I want to give you something in return. I want to give you a place where you are welcome, a home, with me. Lyra's eyes filled with tears and she blinked them away impatiently. I am not used to this, to being wanted. Get used to it. Garrett pulled her close and she came willingly, resting her forehead against his. I want you, Lira Zanwick. I want you to stay, not just for a few days, but for good. Will you? Yes, Lira whispered. Yes, I will. They sat by the stream for a long time, holding each other and talking about the future. Garrett told her about his lodge and the work he did as gamekeeper, and Lira talked about her hounds and the breeding program she wanted to expand. They made plans, tentative at first and then more confident, and by the time they walked back to the lodge that evening they were both smiling. The village was slower to accept the news. When Garrett announced that Lira would be staying permanently and that they intended to marry, there were raised eyebrows and whispered conversations. But Emma and her family spoke in Lyra's favor, and the Reeve made it clear that he approved of the match, and gradually the opposition faded. It helped that Lira continued to do good work, finding lost livestock and tracking down predators that threatened the village flocks. She was competent and reliable, and people came to respect her even if they did not fully understand her. They were married in early summer, in a simple ceremony in the village square. The Reeve officiated, and Emma stood as witness, holding a bouquet of wildflowers that she had picked herself. Garrett wore his best clothes, and Lira wore a dress that she had borrowed from the miller's wife, and they spoke their vows clearly and firmly, looking into each other's eyes. Afterward, there was a feast in the square, with tables laden with food and drink and music from a traveling fiddler who happened to be passing through. Garrett and Lira sat at the head of the table, and Emma sat between them, chattering happily about the hounds and the woods and everything else that came into her head. The villagers came one by one to offer congratulations, some of them grudging and others genuine, and Garrett accepted them all with equal grace. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, Garrett looked around at the people he had served for so many years, the village he had devoted his life to, and he felt a deep sense of peace. He had made mistakes, and he had carried the weight of those mistakes for a long time. But he had also done good work, and he had found someone who understood him and accepted him and wanted to build a life with him. That was more than he had ever expected, and it was enough. Lira leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his under the table, and Garrett squeezed gently. She looked up at him and smiled, and in that moment he knew that everything that had come before, all the pain and the guilt and the long, lonely years, had been worth it to bring him to this place, to this woman, to this life. The feast went on late into the night, and when it finally ended, Garrett and Lira walked back to the lodge together, hand in hand, with Emma skipping ahead of them and the hounds trailing behind. The stars were bright overhead, and the air smelled of summer flowers and wood smoke, and Garrett felt lighter than he had in years. They reached the lodge, and Emma hugged them both goodnight before running off to her parents' house, her voice carrying back through the darkness. Garrett and Lira went inside, and Lira closed the door and leaned against it, looking at him with a mixture of happiness and disbelief. "I cannot believe this is real," she said. "I keep thinking I will wake up and find it was all a dream. It is real." Garrett crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. You are here, and you are mine, and I am never letting you go." "Good," Lira said and kissed him. The seasons turned. Summer gave way to autumn, and autumn to winter, and Garrett and Lira settled into their life together. They worked side by side, walking the woods and tending the land and caring for the hounds. Lira's breeding program flourished, and soon other villages were sending requests for pups, and her reputation as a houndswoman grew. Garrett continued his work as gamekeeper, but now he had someone to come home to, someone to share his meals and his thoughts and his bed. It was a good life, quiet and steady, and he was grateful for it. Emma visited often, bringing news from the village and helping Lira with the hounds. She was growing fast, her leg fully healed now, and she had developed a passion for tracking that Lira encouraged. "She has a gift," Lira told Garrett one evening as they watched Emma work with the youngest pups. "If she wants to, she could be a great houndswoman someday." "Her parents would be proud," Garrett said. "And so would I." Spring came again, and with it the Midsummer Thanksgiving, a festival that the village held every year to celebrate the safe return of the flocks from the high pastures and the blessing of a good harvest. It was the biggest event of the year, with a feast and dancing and games that lasted from dawn to dusk. The reeve always presided, and the village elders sat at the head of the table, and everyone who had contributed to the village's prosperity was honored. This year, the reeve asked Garrett and Lira to sit at the head of the table with him and the elders, a gesture that was both an honor and a public acknowledgement of their place in the community. Garrett was surprised and touched, and Lira looked stunned. "Are you sure?" she asked the reeve. People will accept it because I say so," the reeve said firmly. "You have earned this place, Mistress Zanwick, both of you have, and it is time the village recognized that." The feast was held on a warm, bright day, with tables set up in the square, and the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filling the air. Garrett and Lira dressed in their best clothes and walked to the square together, and when they arrived, the villagers parted to let them through. Some of them smiled, and others nodded respectfully, and a few even clapped as they passed. They took their places at the head of the table, with Emma sitting beside them again, and the reeve stood to give the blessing. He spoke about the importance of community and the value of hard work and dedication, and then he turned to Garrett and Lira. "This year, we have much to be grateful for," he said. "We have a good harvest, healthy flocks, and a village that is strong and prosperous. But we also have two people who have shown us what it means to serve with courage and integrity. Garrett Zane has been our gamekeeper for 20 years, and in that time he has guided us, protected us, and never asked for more than his due. And Lira Zanwick has proven herself to be a woman of skill and honor, someone who does not give up even when the task seems impossible. Together, they remind us that strength comes not from who we are born as, but from what we choose to do." The crowd murmured approval, and the reeve raised his cup. "To Garrett and Lira, and to all who serve this village with honor." "To Garrett and Lira," the crowd echoed, and Garrett felt his throat tighten. He looked at Lira and saw that her eyes were bright with tears, and he reached for her hand under the table and held it tight. The feast began, and the food was brought out, platters of roasted meat and fresh vegetables and pies made with early berries. There was laughter and music, and children ran between the tables, playing games and chasing each other. Emma stayed close to Garrett and Lira, talking nonstop about the hounds and the woods and her plans to become a tracker when she was older. As the sun began to set, the fiddler struck up a dance, and people moved to the open space in the center of the square. Garrett stood and offered his hand to Lira. "Dance with me." "I do not know how," Lira said, but she was smiling. "Neither do I. We will learn together." They joined the other dancers, and Garrett put his arm around Lira's waist and took her hand in his. The steps were simple, just a turning pattern that matched the rhythm of the music, and they stumbled at first, laughing at their own clumsiness. But then they found the rhythm, and they moved together, circling and swaying, and Garrett looked into Lira's eyes and saw his own joy reflected there. The music played on, and the stars came out, and the village celebrated. Emma danced with other children, her laughter ringing across the square, and the adults drank and talked and told stories late into the night. Garrett and Lira danced until their feet ached, and then they sat at the table again, watching the festivities and holding hands like the newlyweds they still were. "Are you happy?" Garrett asked quietly. "More than I ever thought I could be," Lira said. She leaned against his shoulder, just as she had that night by the fire, and Garrett wrapped his arm around her and held her close. "Good," he said, "because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." Lira laughed softly. "I think I can live with that." They sat together as the night deepened and the feast wound down, and Garrett thought about the long road that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the shepherd who had died in the cold and the years of guilt that had followed, and he thought about the night he had sat awake by the fire, holding Lira while she slept, too afraid to move and wake her. He thought about the choice he had made to keep searching, to not give up, and about the way that choice had changed everything. He had found Emma alive, and in doing so he had found Lira, and in finding Lira he had found himself again. The guilt was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer defined him. He had learned that mistakes could be survived, that redemption was possible, and that sometimes the things you were searching for found you instead. The feast ended, and the villagers began to drift home, calling good nights and blessings as they went. Emma hugged Garrett and Lira one more time, then ran off with her parents, her voice carrying back through the darkness. The reeve clasped Garrett's hand and thanked him for his service, and then he was gone too, and Garrett and Lira were alone in the square under the stars. "Come on," Garrett said, standing and offering his hand. "Let us go home." They walked back to the lodge together, hand in hand, and the hounds met them at the door, tails wagging and tongues lolling. Lira knelt to greet them, running her hands over their heads and murmuring soft words, and Garrett watched her with a feeling in his chest that was almost too big to contain. This was home. This was family. This was the life he had built, brick by brick, choice by choice from the ashes of his mistakes, and it was good. Lira stood and turned to him, and Garrett pulled her close and kissed her, slow and deep, pouring everything he felt into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Lira was smiling, her face soft and open in a way that still amazed him. "I love you," she said. "I do not think I have said that enough." "You say it every day," Garrett said, "in 1,000 different ways, but I never get tired of hearing it." "I love you," Lira said again, and Garrett laughed and kissed her once more. They went inside, and Garrett closed the door on the night and the stars and the village beyond. Inside the lodge, the fire was burning low, and the hounds settled into their places, and Garrett and Lira stood together in the warm, golden light, holding each other and knowing that they were exactly where they belonged. The years passed, gentle and full. Garrett and Lira grew older together, their hands growing rougher and their hair showing more gray, but their love remained constant. Emma became a tracker, just as Lira had predicted, and she brought her own hounds to the lodge to train with Lira's pack. The village prospered, and new families moved in, and Garrett and Lira became fixtures of the community, respected and trusted and loved. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the hounds were fed, Garrett and Lira would sit by the fire, and sometimes Lira would lean her head on his shoulder, just as she had that night so many years ago. And Garrett would hold her, careful and steady, and he would remember the choice he had made to keep searching, to not give up, and he would be grateful for everything that choice had brought him. He had learned, in the end, that redemption was not a single moment but a lifetime of small choices, each one building on the last. He had learned that love was not something you found but something you built, day by day, with patience and care and unwavering faith. And he had learned that sometimes the weight you carried could be lightened, not by setting it down, but by finding someone willing to help you carry it. Lira was that someone. And Garrett had never moved all night long because he had known, even then, that she was worth protecting, worth holding, worth keeping, and in the end that had made all the difference.